The wind carried the cry before he saw her. Boone had been tracking elk for 3 days when his injured wolf, Ash, stiffened beside him. The animal, gray, lean, limping from an old trap wound, growled low in his throat and turned toward the sound. A scream, not of fear, but of someone being broken. Boone froze. Another cry followed, hoarse and full of grit. Woman. Pain. Then silence. Without a word, Boone dropped his gear. Ash was already ahead, limping but determined, dragging his bad leg through the underbrush like it didn't matter anymore. Boone followed, heart tight and rifle ready. They crested a knoll and looked down on a half-collapsed homestead. Paint peeled from the boards, porch sagging, fence broken like it had given up long before the woman inside had. Boone saw 2 figures riding off in the distance, dust trailing behind them. He couldn't see their faces, but he knew the type, leaving bruises behind them. The cabin door hung open, and then, from under the porch, something moved. A small hand. Then another. 2 little girls, no older than 4 or 5, crawled out from beneath the boards, eyes wide and tearless the way only children who've seen too much too early can be. They ran to something slumped near the steps. A woman, face bloodied, dress torn, one sleeve half missing. She was trying to rise, shielding her body over theirs like her arms alone could stop the world. Boone stayed frozen. He'd seen death, seen cruelty, but this was worse than wolves. Then Ash moved. The wolf limped down the slope, slow but certain, tail low, head bowed, not like a hunter but like a pilgrim. He padded right up to the woman, sniffed her trembling fingers, and, without hesitation, laid down beside her. Curled up against her ribs like he'd found his home. The woman flinched at first, then looked into the wolf's eyes and stilled. Boone felt something shift in the air. He approached slowly, rifle slung but voice quiet. "Ma'am," he said gently, though she didn't flinch at him, only looked up with cracked lips and hollow strength. "Did they do this to you?" She didn't speak, just pulled the girls closer. Boone dropped to one knee, eye level with the wolf. "Ash don't trust easy," he said, "but he walked to you like he knew your pain." The woman closed her eyes. "Because he did." Boone looked at the children, then at the cabin, then at her. "You're coming with me," he said quietly. "All of you." And the wolf raised his head as if to say, "Finally." Boone didn't speak as he led the widow and her twin girls up into the mountain. The trail was steep, the wind sharp with pine and thawing snow, but none of them complained, not even the children. The woman walked with her jaw clenched, one arm cradling her bruised ribs, the other holding both girls close. Behind them, Ash limped steadily, the old wound in his hind leg reopened but ignored. When they reached Boone's cabin, a quiet stone structure tucked into the slope like it had grown there, he opened the door and motioned them inside. It wasn't much. 1 room, a stone hearth, a low bed, and shelves of dried herbs and tanned hides. But it was warm, and it smelled like wood smoke and meat. The woman looked around without expression and allowed Boone to help her onto the bed. The girls settled on the floor beside Ash, who curled around them like a second blanket. Boone set to work silently, stirring broth over the fire and preparing a basin of hot water and pine salve. He cleaned the blood from the woman's temple without asking her name. She winced, but didn't pull away. Her eyes stayed on him, watchful, exhausted, but steady. Boone had seen that look before. Women who had been beaten long before the bruises showed. She ate slowly, shakily, as if her mouth had forgotten how. The girls didn't speak either, just held each other and whispered into Ash's fur. It wasn't until long after sunset that the woman's voice cracked the silence. They said I cursed their bloodline. Boone didn't answer, just turned the elk bones over in the stew pot. Twin girls. No sons. They said I was the reason their family name would die. After my husband passed, they came for the land, the house, and finally, me. Her voice didn't tremble, but her eyes burned. They beat me for birthing wrong. Boone rose and walked to the hearth, where he used a stick to write 3 words in the ash. They were wrong. She read it, then whispered, "You always write instead of speak?" He nodded once. "Why?" she asked. "Because men say too much, and still miss the truth." She was quiet for a while. Then she reached out and touched Ash's matted fur. "Your wolf. He walked to me first." Boone watched her. "He knows pain when he sees it." She nodded slowly. "So do you." He didn't deny it. She sat back, exhaled deeply, and finally said, "Lena." He nodded again. "Boone." She leaned her head against the wall, eyes closing. "Thank you for not asking questions." Boone glanced at her, at the girls asleep against the wolf. The mountain never needed answers, he thought. It just needed someone to survive. The knock came just past noon, loud and sharp like it had no business waiting for permission. Boone was outside splitting pine logs, sweat on his brow despite the chill, when he heard the girls scream. Not from pain, but from memory. The kind that lives in the bones. He dropped the axe and moved before the echo faded, his feet crunching snow as he reached the cabin. Inside, Lena stood frozen near the hearth, her eyes wide with a terror she hadn't worn the night before. Ash was already between her and the door, growling low, body braced despite his injured leg. Boone didn't hesitate. He stepped past the girls, past Lena, and opened the door. 2 men stood there, leather coats, crooked teeth, and a swagger that came from never being told no. One held a rope, the other a smirk. "We come for what's ours," the taller one said. "Widow ran off with our kin's property. You hand her over, we don't make trouble." Boone didn't answer. He stepped outside, shut the door behind him, and stared down the mountain as if measuring how far he'd have to drag 2 bodies. The shorter man squinted. "You deaf, mountain man? Or just dumb?" Boone's hand went to the hunting knife strapped at his hip, not a threat, just a promise. The taller one shifted his weight, clearly less sure of himself now. "You don't want this fight," he said. Boone moved closer. No words, just presence. Heavy, unflinching, final. Behind the door, Lena pressed her hand over her mouth, heart pounding. She knew the voices, knew their fists and their lies. But what scared her more was the silence. Boone didn't need words to make men afraid. After a long pause, the taller one spat into the snow. "She'll come down eventually. You can't hide her forever." Boone took 1 step forward. Just 1. That was enough. The men backed off, muttering curses, and rode off with the kind of speed cowards use when their shadows get too long. Boone watched until the dust settled, then turned and went back inside. Lena stood there, trembling, her fingers curled against her skirt. "They'll come back," she whispered. Boone nodded. He walked to the hearth, picked up a stick, and wrote in the ash, "So will I." She stared at the words, then at him. And for the first time, she smiled. Not because she felt safe, but because someone had finally chosen her side without being asked. Ash limped to her feet and licked her hand, as if to say it too. In this cabin, on this mountain, they weren't prey anymore. They were chosen. Boone rose before dawn the next morning, but when he reached for the firewood, he found it already stacked. Not neatly, but with small hands. Twigs, bark, and 2 pine cones placed carefully in a line beside the hearth. The girls had done it. He glanced over. They were curled beneath a fir near the fire, Ash resting between them, his breathing slow, steady. Lena slept nearby, dark circles still under her eyes, but her face had softened, like sleep had offered a brief truce from the memories. Boone knelt near the girls and waited. A few minutes later, one stirred, the smaller one with freckles and tangled curls. She looked up at Boone, blinked once, then reached out and pressed her tiny fingers into Ash's fur. "Is he hurt bad?" she whispered, her voice small as birdsong. Boone shook his head slowly. She watched him. "He picked Mama," she added, with the quiet certainty of a child who'd seen something sacred. Boone nodded. The other twin opened her eyes, sat up, and placed a doll, made of sticks and cloth scraps, into Ash's paws. "He protects us now." Boone didn't speak. He just knelt beside them and added 2 small pieces of dry birch to the fire. The girls watched him without fear now, not because he'd spoken, but because Ash had. Wolves didn't lie. Later that day, Boone took Ash outside to check his bandage. The wolf limped toward the edge of the clearing, then stopped near a half-buried pile of stones. Boone followed. The earth was soft there, newly turned. He knelt, brushed away the moss, and saw something that made his gut clench. A child's scarf. Faded pink, torn at one end, too small to belong to either of the girls. He stood slowly, eyes narrowing. When he returned to the cabin, Lena was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes hollow again. Boone set the scarf gently on the table. She stared at it for a long time. "Her name was June," she said, voice flat. "My firstborn, stillborn they claimed, said girls weren't worth a midwife. I held her for 10 minutes before they buried her without a marker." Boone didn't move. She looked up at him, tears not falling, just suspended. "I thought they'd taken everything. But your wolf, he found proof I didn't imagine her." Ash stepped forward and placed his head in Lena's lap. She broke then, folding over him, the sound of her grief raw and low. Boone stood there, still and certain. He didn't offer words. He offered presence. And in that silence, Lena mourned her first daughter, not alone, not in hiding, but in the open light of morning, where even wolves knew to grieve. Boone didn't speak of the scarf again, but the next morning he carried wood from the shed and began hammering planks behind the cabin. Lena watched from the doorway, the girls curled at her feet with Ash sleeping nearby, his bandaged leg stretched into the sun. She didn't ask what Boone was building. She just watched his back move steady beneath the flannel, watched the muscles in his arms flex with each swing of the hammer, each measured cut. By midday, a small frame had begun to take shape, square and solid, about the size of a child's bed. She knew what it was. A grave marker. But not one of stone. This one would hold weight. A frame to honor, not to bury. That afternoon, he brought her a paintbrush, a tin of leftover whitewash, and a piece of cedar. He set them down and tapped the board with 2 fingers. It was a gesture, not a demand. She understood. That evening, while the girls napped with Ash beside them, Lena sat beside the fire and wrote the name carefully. June. She didn't weep. She didn't speak. She just painted the letters as if writing them finally proved her daughter had lived. The next day, Boone took the board and nailed it above the cedar frame, then filled the inside with wildflowers and pine cones the girls had gathered without being asked. No sermon, no scripture, just presence. That was how grief lived on the mountain, not with noise, but with memory. Afterward, the girls danced around the marker, placing petals and shiny stones at its base like it was something sacred. Ash lay beside it, tail thumping faintly, head on his paws. Lena walked to Boone where he stood at the woodpile and looked up at him. "No one's ever built me anything before," she said softly. He didn't reply. He reached into his coat, pulled out his charcoal, and wrote on a scrap of bark. "They built their names on your silence. I'll build mine on your truth." She didn't know what to say to that, so she folded the bark into her palm, like it was something rare. That night, she sat beside the fire with her girls in her lap, and the wolf curled at their feet. She looked around the cabin, not just walls and roof anymore, but something steady. The fear hadn't left, not fully, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel temporary. Boone hadn't promised her safety. He'd built her something better, a place no man could take, a grave remembered, a name reclaimed, and space enough for a future that hadn't yet begun. The snow came in the night, quiet and sudden, covering the clearing like a blanket meant to smother what couldn't be forgotten. Boone woke early, stepping outside to check the traps along the ridgeline before the tracks vanished beneath the white. Ash tried to follow, his limp still pronounced, but Boone placed a firm hand on the wolf's back and shook his head. "Stay," he said softly, the only word he'd spoken aloud in days. Ash held his gaze for a moment, then reluctantly sat back, breath steaming in the cold. Boone left without another word. Back in the cabin, Lena dressed the girls and boiled spruce tea. She'd begun to move differently now, slow, still bruised but rooted, like she no longer expected the world to tilt beneath her feet. The girls played quietly in the corner, drawing with bits of coal on a piece of birch bark. One drew a big wolf with a crooked leg. The other drew a house with 4 people inside. Lena stared at that drawing for a long time. Boone didn't return by noon or by dusk. By nightfall, Lena stood by the window, her arms folded tight around herself, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of motion. The snow had thickened, falling sideways now, blown by wind that whispered things she couldn't hear. Then Ash rose. He stood, tested his bad leg, and growled low. Not in fear, but in decision. Before Lena could stop him, he pushed the door open with his snout and disappeared into the white. She called after him once, but he didn't look back. The girls came to her side, clutching her skirt. "Where's he going?" one whispered. "To find him," Lena answered, heart tight. "He never lets him go far alone." Hours passed. She fed the girls, put them to sleep near the fire, but she couldn't rest. She wrapped herself in Boone's old coat and sat by the window, eyes burning. Then, just before dawn, a shadow appeared through the snow. Boone, slumped forward, coat torn at the shoulder, blood dark against his sleeve. Ash walked beside him, panting, limping harder now. Lena ran to the door and opened it wide. Boone staggered inside, collapsing onto the floor with Ash curled tightly against his side. "Trapline," he murmured, voice cracked. "Mountain lion." She dropped to her knees, pressed a cloth to his arm. "Why didn't you call for help?" He looked at her with that steady silence and whispered, "Didn't know if I had the right." Her hands stilled. "You do now." Behind them, Ash let out a soft huff and rested his head on Boone's boot. He'd followed his human into danger and brought him home again. And in that small cabin, the line between man, beast, and family blurred completely. Boone didn't wake for nearly a full day, his breathing shallow, skin clammy, the bandage on his arm soaking through twice before the bleeding slowed. Lena never left his side. She heated water, crushed herbs into poultices, and wrapped his wound again and again until her fingers stung from the lye soap. The girls stayed quiet, sensing something fragile in the air. their laughter tucked away like a secret too dangerous to share just yet. Ash never moved from Boone's boots. He lay there like a sentry, eyes half closed, body stiff, only rising once when Lena tried to move too quickly past him, just enough to let her know he still judged every motion near his master. That evening, as the light thinned behind the mountains, Lena reached for Boone's belt, the one that held his knife, flint, and the charcoal stub he always used to write. Her hands hesitated. Removing a man's belt was something intimate, something a wife might do, something she'd once done in a house that never felt like hers. But this was different. Boone had bled for her children, for a wolf that should have stayed behind. So she unbuckled the knife belt carefully, slid it off, and laid it beside the hearth like it was something sacred. Then she folded a quilt over his chest, sat beside the cot, and waited. When he finally stirred near midnight, his eyes blinked against the shadows, and she leaned forward. "You're safe," she whispered. "The lion's not here." Boone looked past her, toward the door, then toward Ash. His mouth moved once, no sound. Lena poured him a tin of warm broth and held it steady until he sipped. Then he rested again, and when he woke next, the girls were beside him, one of them holding a small piece of bark with charcoal lines drawn in crooked circles. "That's you," she said proudly. "And that's Ash. And that's Mama." Boone stared at it, then looked at Lena. Her face didn't blush, didn't flinch. She only said, "They wanted to draw home. That's what they see." Boone blinked slowly, something cracking open behind his silence. He reached for the charcoal, but Lena caught his hand before he could write. "Not this time," she said. "Just listen." And then she told him what she hadn't told anyone, not even herself. That she'd never wanted a husband made of fists and land, that she'd once dreamed of a life in the pines, not the parlor, and that the first real kindness she'd ever known came from a wolf, then a man who didn't speak. Boone listened. No words, no judgment, just the kind of quiet that holds space for a story to be rewritten. The knock came softer this time, not a demand, but a question. Boone was still healing, arm bound in fresh linen, his strength returning slow and steady like the thaw after a hard winter. Lena stood by the door, the girls behind her, Ash already on his feet, growling low. Boone rose, slower than usual but upright, and opened the door to find a man he recognized. Not because they'd met, but because he'd seen that same face in the girls. The jawline, the eyes. It was their uncle. One of the ones who hadn't swung a fist but hadn't stopped one either. He held his hat in both hands, fingers twisting the brim. "I heard what my brothers did," the man said quietly. "I didn't know the full of it. Didn't want to know. That's on me." Boone didn't speak. Ash stepped forward, teeth bared, until Lena placed a hand on his back. The man looked at her then, and his voice cracked. "I came to see if you're alive, and to say I was wrong. We all were." Lena didn't answer, didn't step forward, but something in her face shifted. A flicker of something old and tired, still burning. "Your brothers," Boone finally said, voice low, "won't come back up this mountain." The man nodded. "They won't. One got arrested after a fight in town. The other rode west. He won't last long." Boone stepped outside. "What do you want?" "Nothing," the man replied. "Just wanted to see her standing, and the girl smiling." Boone stared at him. Then, after a pause, he said, "She doesn't need your guilt." The man's eyes filled, but he nodded. "I know. Just needed to say it out loud." Boone turned to Lena, and she gave the smallest nod. Boone walked past the man, down the trail, picked up a wooden crate the visitor had left hidden behind a tree. Flour, dried beans, a jar of honey, and 2 tin dolls carved by hand. No words passed as Boone returned, handed the crate to Lena, then turned back to the man. "You walk down," he said, "or you fall down. But you don't stay." The man's throat bobbed, then he nodded. "I'll walk." Boone followed him part way, rifle slung, Ash pacing like a shadow. At the halfway point, the man slipped on the icy ridge and twisted his ankle bad enough he couldn't stand. Boone said nothing. He just lifted him over his shoulder, carried him the rest of the way, and left him where the mountain gave way to flat earth. Then he returned home. No pride, no praise, just silence. When he reached the cabin, Lena was watching from the doorway. She didn't ask what happened. She only said, "Thank you." And Boone, for the first time, whispered back, "You're welcome." Boone started building it at dawn, before the girls woke, and before Lena could ask why. He hauled old planks from the shed, measured each board by eye, and began to hammer without speaking. Ash lay nearby in the sun, his leg still stiff but healing, while Lena watched from the doorway, arms crossed, unsure what to make of the new construction. It wasn't a fence, not a grave marker, not even a storage lean-to. Boone was building a porch, a real one, wide, with steps and beams that could hold weight, and railings smooth enough for small hands. When she finally asked, "Why a porch?" Boone didn't answer with words. He picked up a stick, dipped it in a tin of pitch, and wrote one sentence on the cabin wall. "So you never have to hide under one again." Lena stared at the words, then at the man with the hammer and the wolf at his feet, and something broke loose inside her. Not pain, not sorrow, but relief so deep it made her knees weak. The last porch she'd known had been the one she'd crawled under with her daughters, bruised and breathless, while boots stomped above. This one was hers. The girls helped him paint the beams with leftover whitewash, giggling as they left tiny handprints in the corner post. Ash dragged an old pelt beneath the steps and lay there like a sentinel, his tail thumping every time Lena walked past. When it was done, Boone stood back and looked at the structure like a man who didn't expect applause. Lena stepped onto the porch that night barefoot, the wood warm under her soles from a day's worth of sun, and stood at the edge where the mountains spilled open before her. The stars were just beginning to prick through the sky. The air was still. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood there, steady and upright, and for the first time in her life, unafraid of what might come up the road. Boone sat nearby on the steps, whittling something she couldn't see yet. The girls slept behind them, curled under the same quilt, and Ash lay beside the door like he belonged there more than any man ever had. Lena turned slightly toward Boone and asked softly, "You build things for everyone you rescue?" He looked at her, the corners of his mouth twitching almost into a smile. Then he shrugged, reached into his pocket, and handed her a tiny carved wolf with one crooked leg. "No," he murmured, "just the ones worth keeping." And Lena, for once, didn't argue. She just held it like it meant something. Because it did. Spring came slow but sure, melting the snow in patches, waking the earth beneath the cabin with tiny shoots of green and the promise of something gentler. Lena had begun planting in the shallow plot Boone cleared beside the porch, her hands in the soil, the girls helping with handfuls of seeds and muddy joy. The wolf limped less now, following them with quiet eyes and resting in the sun like he'd finally claimed peace. Boone repaired the roof, added a second shelf inside, and whittled more tiny animals, foxes, hawks, even a carved pine tree the girls tucked beneath their sleeping furs like a secret forest. Then, one morning, the sound of hooves cracked through the birdsong. Lena looked up from the garden and froze. A wagon approached, slow but heavy, and behind it rode 3 townspeople: the sheriff, the preacher's wife, and a man she hadn't seen since her husband's funeral, her late husband's cousin. Boone stepped onto the porch, shotgun over one shoulder, face unreadable. Ash appeared beside him like smoke, tail low but steady. The sheriff raised a hand. "We came to speak with the lady," he said, not quite meeting Boone's eyes. Lena stood, wiping dirt from her fingers, her jaw tight. "What for?" she asked. The preacher's wife stepped forward, eyes flitting toward the children. "There's been talk in town that you're living up here indecently." Boone didn't move, but Lena stepped onto the porch beside him. "You mean safely," she said. "With my children, unbothered and alive." The cousin cleared his throat. "There's still land tied to your name. Legal matters. Some feel it should return to your husband's side." Lena looked at Boone, then at Ash, then back to the townsfolk. "He's buried with no marker, no record, no honor. That land died with his fists." The sheriff shifted. "We didn't come to take anything. We just thought you should know the town hasn't forgotten." Boone stepped down then, slow and heavy, and handed the sheriff a tin. Inside were Lena's bruised clothes, the scarf from the child they buried, and the carving Boone had made of the wolf with the crooked leg. "Give them this," Boone said. "Let them remember right." The sheriff took it without a word. When they rode off, no one looked back. Lena sat on the porch that evening as the sun slipped behind the ridge. Boone handed her a cup of tea, and Ash lay at her feet, eyes closed. The girls played near the garden, laughing like bells. "They came to shame me," Lena whispered, "but we've already built better." Boone said nothing. He just reached for her hand, and this time she didn't let go.